The coffee machine at Patty's diner had been broken for 6 days. Elena Marsh knew this because she was the one who kept apologizing for it, table after table, shift after shift, wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She refilled water glasses, carried plates that burned her forearms, and drove home at midnight in a car that took 3 attempts to start. Always 3. Never 2, never 4. 3 turns of the key, a small mechanical prayer, and then the engine would groan into something resembling life. Her apartment smelled like old radiator heat and the faint ghost of someone else's cooking. The wallpaper near the bathroom door had been peeling since October. She had mentioned it to the landlord twice. She had stopped mentioning it. This was Elena's life, not a tragedy, exactly. Just a life that had been slowly, quietly squeezed into something smaller than it was supposed to be. She didn't know her grandmother Margaret was dead until a Tuesday morning, 3 days after it happened. Not a phone call, a text from a cousin named Bria, whom she hadn't spoken to in 4 years. "Hey, just in case nobody told you. Grandma Margaret passed Friday. Service was yesterday. Sorry." Elena read it standing in her kitchen, still in her work uniform, a piece of toast going cold in her hand. She didn't cry immediately. That was the strange part. She just stood there, feeling the particular weight of mourning someone she had never fully been allowed to know. Not grief, exactly. Something lonelier than that. She drove 4 hours in her diner uniform because there was no time to go home and change. The name tag was still pinned to her chest when she walked into the lawyer's office. A small brass rectangle that said Elena in clean black letters, as if she needed reminding of who she was. The room was already full. Aunt Gloria sat near the window in a charcoal blazer and a single strand of pearls, her posture the kind that comes from decades of believing you belong in every room you enter. Cousin Derek was beside her, jacket pressed, phone face down on the table in the performance of respectful attention. There were others. Cousins, a family friend, a woman Elena didn't recognize at all. Everyone had been told in time to dress for it. The lawyer read carefully and without drama. The house to Gloria, the antique collection to Derek. The savings accounts, the jewelry, the car, the silver, distributed in clean, considered portions among people who had apparently been expected. Elena sat with her hands folded and listened to her family's future being arranged without her name in it. Then the lawyer paused, a small, almost apologetic pause. To Elena Marsh, one item, stored separately. A key. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then someone laughed, quiet, involuntary, and cruel. The lawyer handed her a small manila envelope. Inside was a single iron key, tarnished almost black, heavy for its size. No note. No explanation. Elena pocketed it and left before anyone could see her face. She put it on the kitchen table when she got home and sat across from it, like it was a person she wasn't sure she trusted. It was heavier than it had any right to be. Not large. It fit easily in her closed fist, but dense, with the kind of solidity that spoke of real iron, not the hollow alloys of anything modern. The surface was dark with age, pitted in places, smooth in others from what must have been decades of handling. Someone had held this key many times. Someone had cared about it. Near the base of the bow, almost invisible beneath the tarnish, were markings, not decorative scrollwork, something more deliberate. A symbol, or perhaps the remnant of one, worn so close to smooth that she had to angle her phone flashlight, just right to see the impression at all. She photographed it from 4 angles and posted it to an antique identification forum with a single question: "Does anyone recognize this?" She expected nothing back. She nearly closed the app when her phone buzzed with a different notification entirely. A call. Derek, his voice was warm in a way she didn't recognize from the lawyer's office. Casual. Friendly, almost. He said he collected old hardware, keys especially, and that he'd happily take it off her hands. $500, no fuss. Probably junk, he said. Just a hobby thing. The word probably stayed with her long after she hung up. She did not sleep that night. She started searching the way people do when they don't expect to find anything. Idly, almost defensively, as if the act of looking was just something to do with her hands at 2 in the morning. But Margaret Marsh was not who Elena had been allowed to believe she was. The woman Elena had known, or half known, from a careful distance, was a quiet figure in a cardigan who went to church on Sundays and kept hard candies in a ceramic dish by the door. Modest, unremarkable, the kind of woman a family could easily overlook. The woman in the newspaper archives was someone else entirely. Margaret Marsh, born 1941, appeared in the social pages of 3 different county papers throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Photographed at charity galas in long gloves and structured gowns, mentioned in property columns as the daughter of one of the region's oldest land-owning families. In one photograph, dated 1967, she stood on the stone steps of an enormous countryside estate, composed and unhesitating, staring directly into the camera with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once doubted her place in the world. The estate name, printed beneath the photograph in neat caption type, was Aldenmore House. Then, somewhere around 1971, Margaret simply disappeared from the record. No more galas, no more property mentions, no photographs, nothing. She resurfaced in the early 1980s in a small town, ordinary, private, unreachable, 11 years, completely unaccounted for. The forum response came at 6:47 in the morning, while Elena was still in yesterday's clothes with cold coffee she hadn't touched. The username was Harold Vantage Antiques, and unlike the 2 brief replies before his, both guesses, both wrong, Harold's message was long, careful, and written with the particular confidence of someone who had spent a decade handling things other people couldn't identify. He explained that the marking near the base of the key was not ornamental. It was a property crest, a small engraved emblem used by wealthy land-owning estates throughout the early and mid-20th century to distinguish keys belonging to specific buildings on their grounds. The practice was common among families with multiple properties and staff who needed to manage access without confusion. Each key marked in this way was deliberately made, deliberately assigned. He had seen the symbol before, he wrote. Not often, but once was enough, tentatively, and he used that word carefully. He believed the crest corresponded to an estate registered in county land records under the name Aldenmore House. Elena stopped breathing for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Aldenmore, the same name beneath the photograph, the same steps Margaret had stood on in 1967, composed and unhesitating. Harold had added one final detail almost as an afterthought. Aldenmore House had never been sold. No transfer of ownership appeared in any record he could locate. According to current county registration, the property remained listed under the Marsh family name. Elena set the key down on the table very slowly. It didn't open a box. It opened a building. And that building might still be hers. Derek called again that evening. The warmth was gone. His voice had shifted into something measured and flat. The tone of a man who had decided that friendliness hadn't worked, and was now trying a different instrument entirely. He told her she was getting herself confused. That the key was a keepsake, nothing more. The kind of sentimental gesture an old woman makes when she doesn't know what else to put in an envelope. He said the family was moving toward a final estate settlement, and that loose ends, unclaimed items, things not handled through the proper channels, those could create legal complications for everyone involved. He paused meaningfully on everyone. His language was careful. It was the language of a man who had thought about this conversation before making the call. Elena told him she would look into it. Then she hung up and sat very still for 10 seconds before reaching for her laptop. She called the county records office the following morning. The clerk was unhurried and matter-of-fact. Yes, Aldenmore House was registered in the county land database. No recorded transfer of ownership in over 50 years. The listing remained under the Marsh estate, dormant but entirely intact. Elena asked carefully whether she would have any standing to access the property. There was a brief pause on the line. Not confused, just considering. That would be a question for a lawyer, the clerk said, or whoever happens to hold the estate key. Elena looked down at the key, sitting on the table beside her coffee cup. She picked it up and didn't put it down again. She left before sunrise with the key in her jacket pocket and an address she had pieced together from 3 different county documents, none of which agreed entirely on the road name. The countryside came gradually, town giving way to suburb, suburb dissolving into farmland, farmland stretching into something older and quieter that had no particular interest in being named. The sky was the flat grey of a morning that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. She drove with the radio off. The GPS lost signal somewhere along a narrow road lined with ash trees whose branches had grown together overhead into something resembling a tunnel. She kept driving. The gravel beneath her tires announced itself loudly in the silence, and then the trees opened, and Aldenmore was simply there. It was enormous in the way that old things are enormous. Not just in size, but in presence, in the particular weight of something that has stood long enough to develop its own gravity. A 19th-century stone manor, its facade almost entirely consumed by decades of climbing ivy. The windows were boarded. The iron gate at the entrance was laced with rust. The grounds beyond it were wild. Grass waist-high in places, gravel paths reclaimed by weeds, a stone fountain standing dry and silent in the overgrown garden. Elena approached the gate, found the lock, slid the key in. It turned smoothly, as though it had been waiting for exactly this. The gate swung open with a sound like a long, slow exhale. She stepped through. The front door opened with the same key. Of course it did. The smell reached her first. Cold stone and settled dust and something underneath it, faint and dry, like paper that had been kept in the dark for a very long time. Elena stood in the entrance hall and let her phone flashlight move slowly across what the decades had left behind. Aldenmore had not fallen apart. It had simply stopped. The furniture stood exactly where it had always stood. A dining table set for a meal that was never served. The china filmed with dust but unbroken. The chairs pushed in neatly, as though the family had simply stepped away and not yet returned. Paintings hung straight on the walls, landscapes, portraits, a pastoral scene above the fireplace rendered in oils gone slightly dark with age. A grandfather clock at the end of the hallway had stopped at 11:47. Morning or night, there was no way of knowing. In the drawing room, Elena found the photographs. Margaret, young, perhaps 25, luminous in a way that no one had ever thought to describe her, stood in the entrance hall of this very house with her shoulders back and her chin lifted and her whole life apparently ahead of her. Radiant, certain, whole, Elena stood looking at the photograph for a long time. The master study held a large oak desk in the far corner, its surface bare except for dust. Locked, the key turned without resistance. Inside, a leather journal. A folded set of documents, and a sealed envelope, addressed in faded handwriting for the one they gave the least. The envelope opened cleanly, as though the seal had been waiting patiently rather than aging. The handwriting inside was Margaret's. Elena recognized it from an old birthday card she had kept for reasons she never fully examined. But this was not a birthday card. This was several pages, written in the careful, unhurried hand of someone who had chosen every word deliberately and had all the time in the world to do it. Margaret had written it 11 years before she died. She began simply, "By the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will have found the key. Which means you are exactly who I believed you to be." What followed was the truth the family had spent 50 years burying. In 1971, Margaret discovered that her brother, Elena's great-uncle Robert, had been systematically forging transfer documents, quietly redirecting her assets, her accounts, her legal standing, piece by piece, into his own name. It had taken him years. It had been methodical and precise and entirely deliberate. When Margaret confronted him, he denied it. When she looked to the rest of the family, she found people who had already chosen their side, or chosen, which amounted to the same thing, to look away. She could have fought. She had considered it for a long time, but Robert had resources and allies and patience, and Margaret had learned by then what the family was truly made of, so she left. She kept only what could not be forged away from her, the deed to Aldenmore, unsigned and untransferred, and the key that proved it. Then she watched. For decades she watched her family, measuring them quietly, privately, the way you measure people when your survival has taught you that character is the only currency that holds its value. Elena had been excluded her entire life for one simple reason: she had never learned to pretend. She had never traded her honesty for belonging. That exclusion, Margaret wrote, was the only inheritance that truly mattered, because it told me you could be trusted with the real one. Elena sat down on the dusty floor of the study and read the letter twice more before she could see clearly enough to stop. The journal was methodical in the way Margaret had apparently been methodical about everything that truly mattered. Page 31 contained a small hand-drawn diagram of the house's lower floor, and at the center of it, marked with a single careful cross, was a cellar entrance beneath the study's back wall. Behind a wooden panel that had been painted over so many times, it no longer looked like a door. Elena found it exactly where the diagram said it would be. The key fit the cellar lock the way it had fit every lock in this house, completely and without hesitation. The room below was stone-sealed and dry, untouched by the damp that crept through old houses like this one, and it was full. Wooden cases lined one wall, their lids fitted with small brass locks. Inside, gold sovereigns in ordered rows, pre-war jewelry wrapped in velvet that had kept its color, bearer bonds in document sleeves, heirlooms whose value Elena could not begin to calculate, but understood instinctively was extraordinary. The kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply waits, but it was the documents she kept returning to. Flat archival folders on the center shelf, protected in oilskin, the original deeds to Aldenmore, signed, notarized, dated, and bearing Margaret's name with no transfer recorded anywhere beneath it. The estate was not just this room. It was the land, the house, every stone and painting and stopped clock above her head. Elena sat down on the cold floor and cried. Not from sadness, but from the particular overwhelm of finally being seen. She heard the gravel before she saw the headlights, a slow, deliberate crunch that didn't belong to wind or settling timber. Elena climbed the cellar steps and moved to the window in time to watch a dark car roll to a stop outside the iron gate. Derek stepped out first, then a man she didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, quiet, the kind of presence people bring to conversations they expect to turn difficult. Derek's face, when he saw her in the doorway, arranged itself into something that was trying to look reasonable. He told her the property belonged to the whole family, that Margaret hadn't been in her right mind for years, that inheritance law was complicated, and she was standing in a building without proper legal authorization, and that if she would just come and speak with the family's solicitor, everything could be resolved simply and fairly. He used the word fairly twice. Elena let him finish. Then she told him, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, steady, unhurried, almost quiet, that she had photographed every document in the house, the deeds, the journal, the letter, that copies had already been sent to a lawyer whose name she would not be sharing with him tonight. She walked past him to her car. Derek said her name once, sharply. She didn't stop. Behind her she heard nothing, no footsteps following, no door slamming, only silence. And when she glanced once in her rearview mirror, it was the man beside Derek she noticed, standing still, looking up at the house with an expression that had quietly lost its certainty. The weeks that followed were the kind that age a person, not dramatically, but in the small, accumulated weight of waiting rooms and document requests and phone calls that ended without resolution. Derek and Gloria filed a formal challenge within 10 days. Their argument had two pillars: that Margaret had been mentally incompetent in her final years, and that the property had been informally transferred to the broader family estate through decades of implied shared ownership. Their solicitor was expensive and unhurried and clearly accustomed to winning through exhaustion. But the documents did not bend. A forensic specialist examined the Aldenmore deeds and submitted a 12-page report confirming they were authentic, unaltered, and legally continuous from the date of original registration. No amendment, no codicil, no transfer of any kind, formal or otherwise, in over 50 years. The letter presented a separate complication for Derek's team, because Margaret had not used the family's longtime solicitor to notarize it. She had used a private one in a different county, contacted quietly and independently. The document was dated, witnessed, and entirely admissible. Elena sat in the courtroom on the day of the hearing in clothes she had bought specifically for the occasion. The first time in years she had purchased something without checking the price twice. The judge reviewed the submissions in silence, asked 2 clarifying questions, then delivered the ruling. 6 minutes. The family's claim collapsed so cleanly it was almost anticlimactic. Almost. The full picture didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, the way these things always do. A document request here, a financial record there, a detail that only meant something once you held it beside 3 other details and stepped back far enough to see the shape of it. Robert Marsh's original fraud was posthumously documented through archived county filings and a paper trail that had never been fully destroyed, only buried, in the way that guilty people bury things, shallowly and in a hurry. The record of what he had done to Margaret in 1971 was not difficult to reconstruct once someone was actually looking. What emerged about Derek was quieter and, in its own way, worse. For 11 years, Derek had been paying the county's dormant property maintenance fees on Aldenmore, small, unremarkable annual payments, the kind easily lost in an estate account. He had told no one. The fees kept the property from triggering an abandonment review. He had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for the clock to run out, for Aldenmore to be legally declared abandoned and absorbed into the broader estate, where he could then position himself to claim it. When Margaret died, he was 6 months away. She had known. Elena became certain of that, reading back through the letter's careful phrasing. Margaret had known someone was circling. She had simply moved faster. The justice that followed was not loud. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public collapse. It was quieter than that, the devastating, irreversible kind that arrives when the truth simply becomes undeniable and everyone in the room knows it simultaneously. 6 months after the ruling, the fountain ran again. It was a small thing in the context of everything. A stone basin in an overgrown garden, cleared of debris and quietly restored by a local craftsman who had asked no questions and done careful work. But Elena stood and watched the water move on a clear morning in early spring and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. The ivy had been cut back from the eastern facade, revealing stonework that had been hidden so long it looked almost surprised to see daylight. The boarded windows were open now. The dining room china had been carefully cleaned and catalogued. The grandfather clock, examined by a horologist who drove 2 hours to see it, was ticking again, set to the correct time, whatever that meant for a house that had kept its own time for 50 years. Elena had not sold Alden Moor. The thought had occurred to her exactly once, and she had set it aside without difficulty. She thought often about Margaret, not the woman in the cardigan, but the woman on those stone steps in 1967, chin lifted, entirely certain. A woman who had chosen integrity over everything it cost her, and had then spent the rest of her life quietly waiting to find someone else who would do the same. The key sat in a glass case in the front hallway, cleaned but not polished, still dark, still scarred, exactly as it should be. On that bright morning, Elena opened the front door of Alden Moor, stepped inside something that had always been hers, and closed the door gently behind her. If Elena's story moved you even a little, you already know what this channel is about. Real inheritance, hidden truth, justice that actually arrives. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment below. Would you have kept that key, or traded it for $500? I think we both know the answer.